Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Great. Thank you so much for being here today. It's our pleasure to have you. My name is Andra Gillespie. I'm the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute. And on behalf of our staff and visiting fellows, I'd like to welcome you to the 2019 annual James Weldon Johnson Lecture. This event is the final event of our 2018-2019 Public Dialogues in Race and Difference series, and it happens to be our final public event of the academic year. We're so happy that you could join us today. Before I begin, we do have a few announcements and introductions. So first, restrooms are available outside of the sanctuary, both upstairs and downstairs. Also, if you haven't yet, please silence your cell phones. One more thing, and I'm going to remind you of this at the end of the service, or of this talk. We're in a sanctuary. So when this talk is over, this sanctuary does actually need to be converted so that it can host a Maundy, Thursday service today. So we will need to exit quickly to allow for that transition to the book signing venue downstairs. So if you want to shake hands with Dr. Painter or meet her, we can't do it up here. We need to be sure that we do that downstairs. It's my pleasure to acknowledge all of the many partners who have helped put this program together. This would not have come together without our wonderful staff, Rhonda Patrick, Anita Spencer-Stevens, and Latrice Carter. I'd also like to acknowledge the 2018-2019 JWJI dissertation and postdoctoral fellows for the last time since they're getting ready to leave their time here. So if you could all stand up and be acknowledged. In addition, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Department of History, the Institute of African Studies, and the Jimmy Carter Chair in History. In addition to our guest speaker, I also want to acknowledge the special guests who are in the audience. So Dr. Joe Crispino from the History Department, for instance, Dr. Randall Burkett, our recently retired curator of African American collections, and many other wonderful staff and faculty members here. So today we're pleased to welcome a speaker who, like James Weldon Johnson, is the epitome of a polymath. Dr. Nell Irvin Painter earned her undergraduate degree from the University of California at Berkeley and her Ph.D. from Harvard. In addition, she was also educated at the University of Bordeaux in France and at the University of Ghana, West Africa. Over the course of her academic career, she taught at the University of Pennsylvania and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She spent the bulk of her career at Princeton University, where from 1997 to 2000, she directed the program in African American Studies. She currently serves as the Edwards Professor Emeritus of American History at Princeton. Dr. Painter is the author of 8 books and countless articles relating to the history of the American South, race, and gender. Dr. Painter's latest scholarly work, of which she will be speaking today, The History of White People, guides us through more than 2,000 years of Western civilization, illuminating not only the invention of race, but also the frequent praise of whiteness. Dr. Painter has won numerous awards throughout her illustrious career. I won't be able to name them all, but I will just highlight a few. She received the Centennial Medal of the Harvard University Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. She's been a fellow of the Guggenheim Foundation, the Charles Warren Center for American History, the Bunting Institute, the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. In 2007, Dr. Painter served as president of the Southern Historical Association, and she was president of the Association of American Historians from 2007 to 2008. She's also been a recipient of the Brown Publication Prize awarded by the Association of Black Women Historians. After retiring from Princeton, Dr. Painter took up a second career as an artist, earning an MFA in painting from the Rhode Island School of Design. And she writes about these experiences in her most recent book entitled Old in Art School, a memoir starting over. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Nell Irvin Painter.
Thank you. That was terrific. Hello, good people. How nice to see you. Thank you to the James Weldon Johnson Institute and to Audra Gillespie, who has written all about the town where I live, Newark, New Jersey. I have been at Emory before. It's been a long time. It was when my historian colleague Earl Lewis was your provost, and now you have another wonderful colleague of mine, Dwight McBride, as your provost. So clearly, Emory is the place to be. My talk today is called, "What Can the History of White People Teach Us About Race in General?" And I want to stress that I'm talking about a book, not about the whole phenomenon. And the phrases, the James Weldon Johnson Institute's mission and vision statement really inspired me because you're saying we are interested in how systems of social distinction shape identities, modes of knowing, processes of inclusion and exclusion, and acts of representation. So that's exactly what I'm going to be talking to you about. The James Weldon Johnson Institute's mission and vision statement tells us that when we talk about race, one of the most important facets of identity in the United States, it's not just the census. We know that culture and industry influence how we think about identity, and racial identity is one of the cores of American identity. But today I may be taking you in a surprising direction, which is very much of our times. We talk about ways of thinking about identity, racial identity. So yeah, I'm talking about The History of White People, the book, which is a work of intellectual history published at a particular point in time. I mean, all books are published at a particular point in time, you know that. 2010. So it was during the presidency of Barack Obama. It was during a census year when so many people felt that whatever was on the census was what they were as an identity. And so many people in my audience who were white said, "Oh, I don't want to press the white button. I don't want to check white. What can I check?" And I would say, "Well, check black. We need more black people." Because you are the one who decides. But crucially now, 2010 was before the presidency of Donald Trump. And Trump galvanized discussions and recognitions of white racial identity in a way that had never been the case before. So a couple of days after the 2016 election, I actually wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times which was entitled, "What Whiteness Means in the Trump Era." So I recommend that to you for a sort of brief summary of the changes that election made in the way that millions of Americans thought about racial identity when it meant white. Now, the book, The History of White People, the book, originated from my question of why white Americans are called Caucasians. Any of you wondered about that? Let me see your hand if you wondered about that. Okay, yeah, a lot of people. Some of you didn't even wonder? You wondered. But you know what I'm going to ask you next. So many of you put your hands up. How many of you pursued it? How many of you actually chased it down? 3. 4? Okay. So this is normal. And I would ask people, well, why, if you ask yourself that question, and presumably you didn't have the answer, why didn't you track it down? And people will say, well, I don't know, it just didn't seem like the right thing to ask. Or, I thought I was supposed to know. But, I was a grown-up, I was sitting in Princeton, and I thought, well, I'll try to figure out. You know, many of you had exactly the right response when you heard the title of my most recent book, which is Old in Art School. And so I've been on a book tour for that book, and over people ask me about how I make art. Do I want something out of my art? Am I working toward a goal? And I say, no, I make something, and then I make something from that, and then I make something from that. And it kind of grows like that. That's how I wrote my history books. Randall, the biography of Sojourner Truth started with the question of what's the difference? How this contrast between images of Sojourner Truth. You remember, some of you are old enough to remember women's studies. And there was always the image of Sojourner Truth being very, and then so that was the pictorial image, that was the vision of Sojourner Truth. But if you read what she was supposed to have said, ain't I a woman? How do you put these two together? So that was the question for Sojourner Truth. And the question for the history of white people was, started 2000. This is Grozny, which is the capital of Chechnya, which is in the Caucasus. And a picture very like this was on the front page of the New York Times. It kind of looks like Berlin in 1945. So, you know, why are white people in the United States called Chechens? So that's where I started. I wanted to answer that question. Why are white people called Chechens? So the Russians denigrate Caucasians as Southerners, as lawless, wild Southerners, and they called them chorny. Maybe I haven't said that quite right, but close enough, huh? And it means black or dirty or lawless or wild, all sorts of terrible things, you know, things that people say about Southerners. So in Russia, Caucasian is wild Southerners, whereas in the United States, Caucasian is kind of white people. So I started my research in Germany because it turns out that naming pattern started in Germany in the 18th century, where a man named Jan Friedrich Blumenbach, who's considered the father of physical anthropology, invented the five-fold classification, which was horizontal. It wasn't vertical. Asian, American, Caucasian, Malay, and Ethiopian. Those were the five big, he called them varieties of mankind. So Blumenbach, in The History of White People, the book, is in chapter 6. And you will see in chapter 6 that this was based on, mostly on skull measurements, but also in which skull was the cutest. And the Caucasian skull was the cutest. I can't take you through the theme that has continued in my art since then, the Odalisque Atlas, but let me just tell you that it's a really ugly story. But at any rate, so the chapters in the history of white people before chapter 6 explain that the idea of classifying people by race appeared in the 18th century in the Enlightenment. The great classifier, taxonomist Carolus Linnaeus, his great version of his classification of everything in the world, the stones, the frogs, the snakes, all the animals, including people. This was from 1758. I almost fell off this. I think I'm okay. Don't let me get too excited, because I will fall backwards. The idea of human difference was not invented in the 18th century. Obviously, people could look around and see that some people are tall and some people are short. Some people spend their lives on horseback. Some people spend their lives digging stones. Some people are, if they're Greek, civilized, and if not, they're barbarians. But people have been seeing human difference forever. But to call it race, as we do today, that is something from the 18th century. So in Europe, it was mainly according to religions: Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Protestant, Catholic. And these were, Europeans went to war and killed each other about religion. So it was a big deal. So the idea of race became useful in the Western Hemisphere in the 18th century, when Enlightenment science coincided with a burgeoning transatlantic slave trade on an industrial scale. So you have two phenomena coming together in the 18th century. One is classifying people by race, and the other is an industrial scale slave trade. So that's part of the reason, much of the reason, why when we think of enslavement and slave trades, we tend to think about the Atlantic slave trade, and we tend to think about people of African descent. So in the 18th century, epistemology, the market, that is the market for people, maritime technology, imperialism, and wartime politics together created the scheme of racial classification and hierarchy that we recognize today. So that since then, since the 18th century Enlightenment, race in the Americas has mostly meant black. White has been the various leavings by time, place, power dynamics, beauty of black, meaning not black. So white has hardly been as carefully scrutinized and historicized and analyzed as black. My 2010 book, The History of White People, changed that dynamic by subjecting the intellectual history of white American race to careful scrutiny. So the book is about 500 pages long. Anybody happen to have a comment on hand? I mean, on hand. Okay, hold it up and show people how big it is, will you? I mean, it's a really big book. Thank you. See? Big book. So, the main conclusion of this really big book is that things change. Things change. There has never been agreement in the short term or over the long term on the number of human races or how to differentiate them from one another. Should you measure their skulls? Should you count up their intelligence? Should you talk about race temperament, racial abilities, historical legacies, susceptibility to disease? These are all ways that people talk about race, but there's never been agreement on how many races there are, how many white races there are, I'll come back to that, or how you decide where you draw the lines. What race means depends on who is speaking, to whom they are speaking, for what purpose, when, and where. Definitions constantly change according to the number of human races and the number of white races. So you know that now. Things change and there has not been agreement. There's a really hard part in The History of White People, the book, that it's really difficult for readers to understand, And that is that the current number of human races and the current number of white race is something that goes back to the middle of the 20th century. It is not for all time. Even after people started designating people, Okay. I have one here, but you need this one too. Sure. Shall I start again? That's okay. So the way we think about race now goes back to the middle of the 20th century at a particular historical juncture in light of the Nazis, at a moment when the United States needed solidarity, needed to pull in all people to get over the Great Depression and to fight the Second World War. So at that point, anthropologists said there are really only 3 human races. And they were ranked Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid. And the oid tells you that they are scientific. So now we assume that there's one big white race, and it's on a toggle switch. Either you're in it or you're out. That was not the case. That was not earlier the case. So in the 19th century, a thinker like Ralph Waldo Emerson could very easily see that there were several white races. This was commonplace in science. There were several white races. The ones at the top were called Teutonic or Saxon or Anglo-Saxon. Ralph Waldo Emerson thought of himself as a Saxon. And then there were other white races, like the Celtic race. Because remember, Ralph Waldo Emerson lived at the time of heavy, impoverished immigration from Ireland. The Irish immigrants of Emerson's time were very poor, dirty, ignorant people. So therefore, they belonged to an inferior race. And then at the turn of the 20th century, there was the Eastern European Hebrew race. There was the Northern Italian race. There was the Southern Italian race. There were all these white races, many, 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 many white races. And then the non-whites were lumped into big categories like Chinese or Negro. So unless they were in special places like Louisiana, Negro or Chinese was not disaggregated. So poor Catholic Irishmen were definitely white. Poor Italian Neapolitan immigrants were definitely white. They just belonged to inferior white races. That was the thinking in the second half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. They were definitely white. They belonged to inferior white races, plural. Now, interestingly enough, this kind of thinking wasn't just in the United States. For instance, the racial thinkers in France often said, well, you know, there are 2 races in France, they said. The aristocrats belong to the Teutonic race, and the peasants belong to the Celtic race. It was respectable to say that and think like that in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So my book takes readers from European antiquity, before races, into the 19th and 20th centuries, many white races, then one big white race, right into the moment of its publication in 2010. A crucial turning point in the thinking about race is in the mid-20th century. I have told you about the mid-20th century remaking, simplifying the racial hierarchy into just 3 races with just one white or Caucasian race. Something else took place in the middle of the 20th century, which is absolutely crucial for what I want to say today. And that was the distinction between biology and culture. Before the middle of the 20th century, educated people often put the two together, as if your biology dictated your culture. Biology was seen as more permanent than culture. Biology was seen as permanent and dictating your culture. But in the mid-20th century, the school of Franz Boas helped us to see the distinction between biology, which is your body, and your culture, which is your language, what you eat, how you dance, how you talk, all those things that really can change not only from one generation to another, but even within your own lifetime. So Franz Boas, 1858 to 1942, is the key figure here, and I'm going to come back to him in a moment. So my book, The History of White People, includes the 1960s and the 1970s, when American whiteness solidified as one big, undifferentiated race. As the immortal words of Malcolm X, the white man, instead of various white races. If you have your book on hand, chapter 27, Black Nationalism and White Ethnics, talks about the response of white ethnics to Malcolm X and to Black Power. The response was, I'm not white, I'm Italian. I'm not white, I'm Irish. Or maybe I am white, but mostly I'm Greek. And these became, they thought of themselves as the unmeltable ethnics. People who were focusing not so much on their white identity, but especially on their ethnic identity. I'm Italian, I'm Jewish, I'm Irish, gave rise after the 1970s of a phenomenon called heritage tourism. And here's an ad for Italian heritage tourism. It's quite taken for granted now that people go to Italy or go to Israel to find their roots or who they really are, heritage tourism. So the first thing that the history of white people teaches us about race in general is that race is not a biological fact, even though race is supposed to be biological. Race is supposed to be permanent. Race is supposed to be innate. But its definitions change over time and place because race is an ideology that claims to be biological. And it's within that ideology that race's biological claims are vast. But in our time of heritage tourism, we also see a melding of culture and biology. And this comes up in our times since the investigation of the human genome and its commercialization as 23andMe or Ancestry.com or African Ancestors, of companies that will let you swab your cheek and then tell you who you really are. who you really are in terms of your DNA, which means biologically. So it's as if that turn that Boas gave us in the 20th century, it's as if Boas got swept aside, that we no longer had a distinction between culture and biology, that now we have DNA, which will tell you who you are. So today, many Americans, and people in other places as well, believe that biology is destiny. It's no longer a struggle between nature and nurture, it's nature that tells you who you are. Hence the appeal of DNA testing businesses. This is from 23andMe. So you can do the cheap one, which will only give you your ancestry, or you can do the better one that will tell you about your health, because supposedly what's going to happen to you in terms of your bodily health is also hidden in your DNA. Now, we might be tempted to think that only white people would do this. Is that true? You're right. You're right. So if you go to Ancestry.com, this is just a piece of the screenshot. They have several people, and one of the figures is an African-American woman named Courtney. So Courtney swabs and sends and pays. And she discovers that she has links to the Akan and the Asante, a matrilineal society of female warriors, led in the late 19th century by Queen Ya Asantewa. This remarkable woman fought colonization in her country and is still revered in Ghana today for her contributions. So Courtney, who is a light-skinned African-American, has a warrior queen in her background, and therefore her race is more likely to be warrior queen race. I actually have a master's degree, an old master's degree from the 60s in African history. And as you mentioned, I lived in Ghana, and I studied African history before Courtney and before DNA. What I just read to you from Ancestry.com bears little resemblance to what I learned as African history a long time ago. So the 20th century is not the 21st century, and usable knowledge about identity and racial identity has changed over time. As you learn in The History of White People, the book, things change. Today, the ideology of race, with its stress on the crucial role of genetic ancestry in identity, has given rise to the expansion of ethnic tourism into the African American market. So race in American terms continues, like whiteness, to change with time and circumstances. So let me close by focusing a little bit on the industry growing out of the long-term and erroneous linking of biology to culture. Let's return to Courtney and her DNA results from Ancestry.com that linked her to Ghana's Ya Asantewa. Ya Asantewa, 1840-1921. So Ya Asantewa and 21st century tourism has attracted attention of the scholar Linda R. Day, who wrote a marvelous article called "What's Tourism Got to Do with It? The Ya Asantewa Legacy and the Development in Asanteman." And what Linda Day is doing is pulling together the history of Ghana with the industry of ethnic tourism. And she's generalizing this, but she happens to be talking about Ya Asantewa's anti-colonial war in 1900, to note that there has been new commemorations of Ya Asantewa with the rise of tourism and ethnic tourism. So countries like Italy, which is one of the most visited tourist destinations in the entire world, but increasingly now African countries like Ghana are pulling together a usable past so that now there is a celebration of the centenary of the anti-colonial war led by Ya Asantewa. And there are celebrations to honor her memory. But Linda Day asked questions about the cultural, the construct of cultural authenticity as rooted in heritage tourism, and to see how the presentation of a local history is shaped for the ends of tourism. So to recreate the Ya Asantewa story, much had to be left out and smoothed over. For instance, why Ya Asantewa did not win, what kind of support she had from other people in Ashantiland or in what became the Gold Coast. How do you represent those people? How do you represent the traders who told the British about Ya Asantewa, or that Ya Asantewa herself held slaves? How do you present all that for tourism? Well, the answer is you don't. And so this is an invitation from the website of Ghana Travel, which invites you to witness our unique culture. So now, in terms of race as Black changing, in terms of DNA testing and of seeking one's biological ancestry, we now have to fold in the capitalistic interest of an industry called tourism. Thank you.
For a wonderful and thought-provoking talk. Can everyone hear me? Great. So what we'd like to do now is we'd like to open the floor for questions. So we have this microphone set up here, and I'm going to put the mic back here and let you use a question, so please feel free to line up if you have questions. Have a couple of rules. So one, please make your question a question. And then also please keep your question brief. And so I will say, since we are in a church in the spirit of the Black church, I will not hesitate to act like a deaconess and touch your shoulder if it gets a little out of hand, okay? So without that, please feel free to come forward.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. I'm really surprised to hear that you say that the notion of race was created in the middle of the 19th century. I had understood that what justified slavery was the explorations of the 16th and 15th century, and the hierarchical notions and the notion of inferiority that rationalized slavery and all of that terrible history. So what was the ideology behind all that if it wasn't race?
Money.
Sorry?
Money.
But there
Money.
just there wasn't any. That was it. There wasn't any conceptualization of these group as
Well,
inferior.
the conceptualization, the real elaboration comes in the Enlightenment. In History of White People, I talked to you about sugar. And sugar started in what is now the East Indies, Indonesia, and then came across the Crusaders discovered it in what we now think of as the Holy Land or the Middle East, and then brought the taste to Europe. But at that same time, roughly, was it 1453, when the Ottomans cut off the Eastern Mediterranean from Western Europe, and that kind of put the damper on the trade in sugar. Sugar had been produced in the Eastern Mediterranean by several kinds of farmers. Some of them were free, some of them were slaves, some of them were sharecroppers, a whole medley of ways of producing sugar. But once Constantinople, now Istanbul, was cut off, there needed to be a new source of sugar. At that same time, the Portuguese discovered that they had been sort of edging around, looking out for stuff, how are we going to get our sugar? And they discovered that you could get over to what was a newly discovered Western Hemisphere. And it was really great for sugar. So the sugar industry is the short answer to your question.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you for your conversation. So one of the other things that's happening with regards to the 23andMe type folks is actually the criminalization of people based off of the cheek swabbing and sometimes the blood testing as well.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
No, I can't.
Okay.
I can say yes. I can say you're absolutely right. But I can't say more than that because I have not done, I read the papers, that's all I know. And I also know that facial recognition software is also being used. And it seems that in our political economy, just about anything you can invent will be used to lock people up.
Keisha Cameron, I have been following your work, and you via... Better?
Yeah.
Ooh, yeah, I can hear it. My name's Keisha Cameron. I have been following you and your work since I read your book just over a year ago, year and a half ago. And I know you're an artist as well. So I've appreciated the way that you weave stories between those two worlds. And I'm a farmer and a fiber producer. I've started reading, I think it's Sven Beckert's book on the Empire of Cotton.
Yeah.
And I found it interesting that your response to the gentleman's question pointed to sugar.
Yes.
And the sugar, and knowing that that was a large industry, but
Yeah.
cotton being that kind of revolutionized and set the stage for capitalism.
Yeah.
So my first question is, can you talk a little bit more about the cotton industry? And then could you also suggest to this young fiber farmer any resources or point me towards where I could see more black and brown fiber arts? Because there's an absence of
Yeah.
a lot of that history
Yeah.
that's carried forward.
For your second question, on my Facebook page, I'm friends with people who make quilts. But I don't know about fiber artists in the sense of weavers or farmers of color. My West Coast self gets what's called fiber shed, and this is a concept the fiber shed is like a watershed. You know, the watershed is the water that comes into the basin. So the fiber shed is where the stuff that becomes fiber comes from. So my way into it was through Petaluma, California, where farmers and people who raise sheep engage in farming practices that are good for the earth and that are also good for the fiber. So I can't really be of help, but you might want to track down fiber shed. Now, as for cotton, the traditional places for cotton to come from and to nourish the West, that is Europe and then what became the United States, was India and Egypt. For the United States, cotton didn't become a really big industry until the turn of the 19th century with the cotton gin, which really revolutionized the processing of fiber so that a short staple fiber could be used, could be produced for use and for milling without spending too many hours picking this stuff out. So sugar is, you know, this is like the 15th century. And for the West, cotton is more like the 19th century. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a question. Just to kind of put this in context, Emory has classes for people over 55 called...
Use a microphone.
Oh.
Yeah, no, here.
There's one
Yeah,
of my
this
teachers.
microphone. Yeah,
Okay.
there you go.
Emory has classes for people over 55 at their North Druid Hills location, and we have many excellent teachers, including the one standing back there, in many classes that have been investigating the whole topic of race as an identity. And just one comment, I was getting ready to tear up my high school diploma and my college diplomas because all the history that I was taught, you know, particularly in Texas, was in the realm of fantasy. But here's my question. I just finished reading Stamped from the Beginning, and I become so intrigued with how race is used, you know, by people in power. And talk about a propaganda, a very, you know, propaganda through the ages. It keeps, in the book White Rage,
Oh, yeah.
you know, it keeps...
That's a really good book.
It keeps morphing, you know, as soon as, you know, the genome study came out and said, you know, we're 99.9% the same, then people morphed off into another reason why race is so important.
Well, this kind of business pays.
Yeah, it pays. My question is, your book was written in 2010, and given the last 3 years or so, let's say, what would you add or change about your book?
Yeah. It just so happens that this fall I will start an artist book with the working title, The History of White People for Dummies, illustrated by the author with comments on American whiteness since Trump. It will be an artist book. And so, for instance, you know, I started you off by saying that there's this really hard part that people cannot hear, that there used to be more, in science, there used to be more than one white race. Over and over again, I read scholars saying how the Irish became white. Somehow, Noel Ignatieff's book is more persuasive than mine, that people really want to be able to read our categories of race backwards. And that's why I started you by saying things change. And so what you're talking about is that racial distinction is like the DNA of the United States as a nation state. And so it's one of the most useful ones along with gender of dividing people up. But how people use those concepts That changes by time and place and the purpose. What is the purpose? So you're never going to get to, one, what is the scientific definition of race? You're not going to find it because somebody will disagree with you right away. And even if you did find it, it would change. So that simply is not to be. We need to accept that race is a very malleable ideology. Yeah.
Your comments made me think about the eugenics movement in the early part of the 20th century. And my question to you is, our interest in or our use of DNA potentially opening up the door towards the use of that science for classification purposes, similar to race?
Yes, yes. In the sense that we're bound, somebody, is bound to use whatever concept that has a market for it. So in the early part of the 20th century, well, they didn't have DNA testing, but they did have compulsory sterilization. And so that was the policy answer to the idea that some people were genetically, I mean, they didn't use the word genetic, but they were biologically inferior. The term was feeble-minded. And I point out to you that when we think about that kind of policy, we tend to assume that it's mainly being used against black people. This was not the case of the whole feeble-mindedness stuff. Surely black people got caught up in it. But the best-known cases, Buck v. Bell in Virginia in 1925, was a young white woman. And so the people who were sterilized, compulsorily sterilized, were people of all races. So yes, you have to be vigilant, but it's not just DNA. I mean, it's, blue eyes and blonde hair, tall, any kind of human difference that can be, that can be industrialized, basically, yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. You mentioned that Blumenbach used both skull measurements and also notions of beauty as our cuteness, as you put it. As
I should have said beauty.
As ways of determining the categories.
Yes.
I was hoping you would talk a little bit more about the ways in which standards of beauty or notions of beauty are wrapped up in the way in which we categorize race.
I've got a whole chapter in, oh, bless your heart. I'm going to take you home with me. Called Beauty as a Scientific Concept. Because I noticed when I was doing my research, and I did a lot of research, that over and over again, there'd be measurements and there'd be toting up all these, and there'd be charts and everything. But the cinching argument would be, plus the blush makes white women cuter. And that was like, this really does it. So art historians have actually written about the use of the blush as an identifying concept. I don't talk about the blush. I may mention it, but mostly I was fascinated that, and here I come back to Ralph Waldo Emerson, who, it was important for Emerson, his book is called English Traits. And it's a very race book, and he has a chapter in it called Race. And his point is that his kind of white people are the best. And he goes on and on and on about Saxons and how beautiful Saxon men are. He takes it back to the Northmen. It's not clear where this Saxony is. It could be in Denmark, it could be Lower Saxony. It could be the Netherlands, but it's not Saxon like in Eastern Germany. It's not Dresden. It's not Leipzig. It's someplace along the English Channel. And these men were so beautiful. That was Emerson. But before that, for Blumenbach, it's the female character who's beautiful. So his skull, his Caucasian skull, is his beautiful Georgian skull. I am going to Georgia finally this September, and I'm going to take some pictures and bring them back to you so you can see if Georgians really are all that beautiful. I once went to an art museum, an art gallery in Chelsea in New York, where an artist from Georgia, I mean, it was all of the gallery was about Georgian artists. And there was nobody else there but me. So I said to the gallerista, I said, you know, there's this saying, this idea that Georgians are the most beautiful people in the world. Is that true? She said, yes. And she said, not only that, the term gorgeous comes from Georgians. I'll find out. But at any rate, so this skull was from a woman. And one of the reasons that it took me so long to write the history of white people was I was dealing with sources in German and French as well as in English. And the cover letter with this skull, as it came to Blumenbach, says that this was the skull of a female Georgian who died of venereal disease. She was a sex slave. On that happy note.
Pass up an opportunity with someone. You are a national treasure.
Oh, bless your heart. Thank you.
Your work is so significant.
Thank you so much.
And you can see I have your book right here, my Kindle. No.
Oh, okay.
I'm curious because it had seemed as if the Genome Project would lay to rest the issue about race. Yet today we still have white supremacists. What are your thoughts about that?
Just for a moment, yeah. You're absolutely right. And race is very useful. It mobilizes people. It mobilizes, 30–40% of American voters. How are you going to resist that as a way of getting your people in office and in power when that is so potent? So we're not going to get away from this real soon. But having said that, the tenor between like 2000, when President Clinton says, you know, race is useless, we're all 99.90 point the same, and then in about 2004 or 5, a pharmaceutical company discovered that you could market blood pressure medicine according to DNA. It's supposed to be better for black people. So, you know, who's a black person? Well, the people whose doctors prescribe this, I suppose. And then DNA was industrialized, and it became a paying industry. So maybe we need some paying industries that undo some of this. But it will get not undone, but it will subside. It will subside because there are so many more non-black Americans now recognizing what you said about, you know, what you were taught in school, or what the commonplaces of the culture tell you about race. There's so many more non-black Americans who are now willing to hear what Black Americans have been saying about race for all these, well, getting on for centuries now. So I don't think it will be forever what it's like now. But it's true, now is a tough time.
Hi. This has been, your presentation is awesome. And
Thank you.
It's just stimulating a lot of questions in my mind. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the impact and or fallout of the racial construct relative to its impact on African Americans, people of color, and this idea of assimilation, i.e. families in the early part of the 20th century, or even much later, encouraging their offspring to marry light-colored people so that they can acculturate, assimilate much easier. I was curious you to speak about that.
Colorism is a thing. Colorism is a real thing. I live in a neighborhood in Newark that is largely Latino. And every morning, my dear husband goes down to the little deli and he buys the New York Times and the Star Ledger. So we get a paper from New Jersey, and we get a paper from a national paper. And when I look at the images in the state paper and the national paper, I see a multiracial world. When I walk around the Ironbound, I never see a dark-skinned Latina. The culture in the commercial culture in the Ironbound of Newark is a colorist culture. So looking forward, when Latinos are 50% of the population, we'll have all that colorism work to do all over again.
Hi,
Hi.
thank you. You really filled in a gap for me.
Oh, good.
I was concerned with my understanding. When you talked about the 20th century and kind of the mid-20th century and the race classification in the three groups, my mind immediately went to the work that I work on in the human rights and the Human Rights Declaration with the United Nations. That came about at the same time.
It did.
What influence did your research reveal was impacted by that declaration?
The short answer is I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. But the United Nations came out of that same culture influenced by Boas and the really anti-racist. No, they were not anti-racist. Franz Boas believed that race was a thing. He just didn't believe there should be racial discrimination.
Okay.
So I guess you would kind of call him an anti-racist. You see what I mean? And during the Second World War, he and his students, or rather his students, because he died in 1942, he died with a cigar and a glass of wine at lunch in the Columbia University Faculty Club. Just keeled over. 1942, that's a little early. So at that point, it was anthropologists who were felt to hold the truth about how to classify people. And so they made pamphlets which circulated in which the people who were writing about human rights would have known. So I'm sure that that is the same epistemological world.
So it was an intersection somewhere.
I think so.
Okay.
But I can't tell you
Okay.
for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Naomi King, Martin Luther King's sister-in-law, A.D. King's wife, who was also killed, A.D. King, in a swimming pool.
Yeah.
She spoke here recently, and she's a friend, and she's trying to lead a movement to unite humanitarians, to unite people not based on race, religion, country, $1.3 trillion goes to wars where strangers kill strangers. Do you think it's, I really admire her, and I was wondering if you think that something like this could have a long-term impact for future generations?
For future generations, only if it is incorporated, made into something like a United Nations and has millions of people with it. If it, but my sense is that if this is a local, is it local, national, international?
Well, she would like to take it internationally. They've gone to schools
Sure.
and done it, like in public schools.
Right. Yeah, I think that each one of these efforts makes a difference. You know, a long, long time ago, I was an assistant professor. And I taught at the University of Pennsylvania, and I taught for the first and last time African American history. And by the time we got through the year, the students said, oh, all these horrible things happened. What's the use? And I said, well, think of what they would have happened if there hadn't been all this pushback. And I thought of a metaphor for change, and that is like the sand dunes. Sand dunes are made of grains of sand, but they make islands, they make continents. So every effort makes a difference. As a historian, I see very, very little that lasts 2 centuries. You know, people have sometimes asked me, how will people read my books in 100 years? And I say, people will not be reading my books in 100 years. Books don't last that long. So most things don't last that long, but they can be really important at the time and in the place.
I did want to mention one other thing. When I was a medical student at the hospital, Rhode Hospital downtown,
Oh, yes.
They weren't taking blood pressures, and blacks in particular have more strokes, heart
Sure.
attacks, and kidney disease. And the professor there suggested that I, as a medical student, do a study on that. And his father was Albert Tuttle, Sr., who desegregated the South, the federal court judge.
Oh.
And we did that study and then got a big grant, and then with Morehouse Medical School went to Africa, and there were about 1,000 of us who started the International Society on Hypertension in Blacks. And it's, I think, had some major, hopefully some major impact.
Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Painter. I'm also a historian here at Emory, and I use your work in my classes. It's so effective, so it's just really an honor to see you here on our campus. One of the questions I have based on your talk is, what are some of the global processes through which whiteness was consolidated in the mid to late 20th century? And if you have time for a second question, can you talk a little bit about your writing life and how you remain so prolific?
Okay. I wouldn't say that whiteness was consolidated in the 20th century. I would say that various institutions were consolidated. Let's see. As you were talking, I was thinking about imperialism. Political imperialism kind of shrank in the late 20th century. I see from the Times that there are new kinds of imperialisms every day based on debt and development. So whiteness is too big a thing to work kind of in lockstep. And it tends to be an explanation, sometimes in regimes like apartheid, it can be a cause. But usually it's an explanation for something, and that explanation may or may not carry into another place. So I would say look for the details rather than the big concept. Was there another part of your question that I missed? Oh, writing. Let's see. The last book I wrote was Old in Art School, which took about 3-4 years. Is that right? 3-4 years? And it was really hard to start because it's a different kind of writing. And it's a very honest book. And I didn't know I could be that honest in writing and telling you what's in my heart. And I knew that I would have to talk about what a pathetic little person I had become in art graduate school. I didn't know that I could talk to you about how my mother's death made me feel that my time was very limited without my realizing that it was her death that was making me feel that way and make a mistake in applying to graduate school when I did. It was a bad decision. So I wrote a chapter called A Bad Decision. I didn't know I could do that. So it took some time, and it took like 4 or 5 drafts to get to the book. And I could not have done it without 2 artist residencies that took me away from home, because when you're at home, everything needs to be done. So I did an artist residency at UCross Foundation in Wyoming and a residency at MacDowell in New Hampshire. And I hope to go back to MacDowell in the fall to start work on the history of white people for dummies. Can't do it when I stay home. It's just, plus, I now realize that I have a new vocation, which is author of creative nonfiction, which is a full-time job. Just editing and promoting and traveling, plus the history of white people came out in French at the end of January. And so I was in France in February and in March and in Norway in February to talk about those books. And I can't just bound off the plane and start whatever needs to be done. So this is a long way of saying I probably am not going to write anymore until my next artist residency. Yeah, which I recommend to all of you who are writers or scholars, leave home.
Hello.
Hi.
Just a short question, which is that I think a lot about what Dr. John Powell says when he talks about the need to transform the meaning of whiteness, and I'm curious if you had any thoughts on what that might look like,
Yeah.
or what that could look like.
I actually wrote another op-ed in the New York Times about that in 1915. If you just either go to my website has 3 parts. One part is Nell Painter Historian. The middle part is Old in Art School, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Didn't get it, but it was a finalist. And the other part is artist. So look under the history part, and or just search on the New York Times homepage. And it came out about the time of Rachel Dolezal. So they asked me to write kind of about Rachel Dolezal. My sense was, poor Rachel Dolezal, her mother outed her? Her mother? That is a family drama, if you ask me. And I feel about blackness like I feel about gay marriage. that if gay people marry, it takes nothing away from my heterosexual marriage. And if Rachel Dolezal wants to be black and is doing anti-racist work, it takes nothing away from my blackness. So I was going to write that. But then that Nazi killed 15 people who invited him into their church for a prayer service. So that gave it another spin. So I said, white people need another identity. So this is before Trump gave them identity. And I said, there is actually a word that people could use if they're engaged in anti-racist work, and that is abolitionists. We have a history of anti-racist white people, and anti-racist white people should use that history and use the word abolitionist. Okay, thank you so much.